So before Taylor Swift, before the Kardashians, before celebrity culture as a whole, America had Charles Lindbergh, aka Lucky Lynn, a man who achieved international fame winning the Orteig Prize by completing a solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean. Kind of a big deal for the time. Unfortunately, it is for what happened to him after that holds a greater presence in the public memory. An unqualified family catastrophe that was equal parts bizarre, tragic, and absurd. The Lindbergh baby kidnapping. Welcome to Words and Coffee, where we talk interesting history about the Garden State and showcase a bag of small batch roasted goodness. Today's brew is Stumptown Coffee Roasters Holler Mountain Organic Blend. Today's history is the Lindbergh baby kidnapping of 1932. Let's get to it. So just to set the scene a little bit, in 1927, Charles Lindbergh won the Orteig Prize for the first solo crossing of the Atlantic Ocean. While previous attempts had been made, they fell short of the solo criteria. Keep in mind, this was done using paper maps and compasses and without aerial refueling. The likelihood of crashing 1,000 miles from any kind of land, never to be seen again, was fairly high. And so, when the Spirit of St. Louis landed in Paris successfully, this earned him worldwide notoriety. As journalist A. Scott Berg put it, people acted as though Lindy had walked on water, not flown over it. He kept busy during the interwar period, helping to develop interest in commercial air travel, achieving the rank of colonel in the then Army Air Corps Reserve, along with some international travel, which we will cover in depth later. But it was in 1929 that he would meet his wife, Anne Morrows, a fellow pilot, hailing from a well-to-do family. Now, international fame is well and good, but understandably, at a certain point, you kinda just want a bit of quiet. Around the birth of their first child, Charles Jr., aka Chaz, Lindy and Anne settled into a rural estate in Flemington, New Jersey. And for most of 2 years, life was good. And then, on the night of March 1st, 1932, the unthinkable happened. Now, the rural estate wasn't exactly slumming it. It was a 390-acre property, and to maintain it, the Lindberghs employed an entire staff to care for the house, the property grounds, and baby Chaz, whose primary caregiver was one Betty Gow. Around 9 p.m. on March 1st, 1932, Betty went to check on the sleeping Chaz and discovered the 20-month-old baby was missing. Lindy and Anne arrived home shortly thereafter, recently returned from travel abroad, when Betty told them about Chaz's disappearance. They conducted a search of the property which revealed mud on the floor of the nursery, a broken ladder outside the second-story window, and a ransom note on the windowsill demanding $50,000. Local police in Hopewell were initially notified, but state police soon took over the investigation. They examined the nursery, but found no fingerprints or blood. The ladder, a homemade thing, was broken, likely during the descent. The footprints in the mud outside were too messy to get a useful measurement from. The household staff were thoroughly interviewed, especially Betty. Considering Lynn's celebrity status, then as now, the matter got attention at the highest levels, going all the way to the governor of New Jersey. Despite this, Lindbergh played a personal role in managing the investigation alongside, and in some cases above, the police and their official investigation. This comes up later. Over the next week, 2 additional notes were delivered, increasing the ransom demanded, and also refusing the man Lindbergh initially appointed to act as go-between. Instead, the kidnapper suggested, and this is where it starts to get weird, that they put a request for one in the newspaper. And lo and behold, the call for a mediator was answered by Dr. John F. Condon, a retired school principal who agreed to taking the role. Yeah. No hostage negotiator, no lawyer even, just this former school principal. Don't know about you, but having spent some time in my former principal's office, I'm not sure I'd trust mine to collect a lunch order. Dr. Condon also went by the alias Jafsey, and would go on to communicate directly with the kidnapper via newspaper. They would post notes in the classified section, making it more difficult to track the kidnapper. Not to gloss over this part, but this exchange went on for several weeks, utilizing a combination of dead drops and meetings through another intermediary at a park in New York City, this one named John. Eventually, the kidnapper agreed to a reduced ransom, and so provided the baby's location on board Nellie, a small boat located in Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. However, upon arriving there the night of April the 2nd, there was no one to be found. The ransom note stopped, and the trail apparently gone cold. That was until May 12, 1932, when the body of Chaz was found completely by accident by a pair of truck drivers on the side of the road, less than 5 miles from the Lindberghs' home. The medical examiner estimated the time of death around early March, meaning it was entirely possible that the baby had died the night of the abduction. And now this had changed from a kidnapping and extortion case into a murder, and the search for the killer was on. As one might expect, since this crossed state lines, the then young FBI also became involved. Director J. Edgar Hoover reached out to the superintendent of the New Jersey State Police personally, offering all the assistance he needed. That superintendent was H. Norman Schwarzkopf, father of Storm and Norman Schwarzkopf of Gulf War Part 1 fame. That reference probably won't land with anyone under the age of 40, but there you go. The FBI conducted its own investigation, and to this day touts their work as a success, even though it took them 2 years to catch the perp and the victim was long dead. But hey, don't want to set that bar too high now, do we? What they did do was get creative. See, while money was serialized back then and could theoretically be tracked, the sheer level of effort required to actually do so in an era before computers was overwhelming. To put it mildly, imagine if you wrote a white number 8 on the back of 5 Skittles and mixed them into a bowl with several more bags of Skittles. Then you told a class of first graders to take what they wanted from the bowl. And then I told you to find just one of those number 8 Skittles after they had all gone home. But the Fed boys had a novel spin on this old stratagem. In 1933, one of history's favorite icons was about to outlaw the private ownership of gold. For reasons we won't get into, but I encourage you to have a gander, gold would become illegal to own or use as money later that year. Thus, to make the ransom money easier to track, they paid the kidnapper using gold certificates. At a quick glance, they look just like modern dollars, but unlike aircraft carrier bucks, they were redeemable for yellow metal. And thus, with most of the others being pulled out of circulation, it was thought that these notes would stand out. And it worked. Eventually. Now that rescue was out the window, the investigation turned to catching the perp. The plan for which basically consisted of providing bank tellers, merchants, basically anyone that might handle money with a list of serial numbers. In theory, they were supposed to check incoming money against the provided list. Simple, right? Now, anyone who's worked retail or food service probably muttered a big fat, "Yeah, right," just now. For a whole year, there was nothing. But sure enough, in the spring of 1933, a conscientious bank teller, who in hindsight was way overqualified for his job, found some of the ransom money. Not only that, but he had the deposit slip, which included a name and address, information which apparently didn't go anywhere. Another year and a half went by with only sporadic appearances of the gold certificates, until, yet again, the break came from an unlikely source. September 15th, 1934, another man too qualified for his job received a $10 gold note used for payment. He noted the license plate number and got a description. 4 days later, Bruno Hauptmann was arrested, and the evidence was both damning and about as ironclad as one can get while still technically being circumstantial. In addition to having several gold certificates of the ransom on his person, police found pieces of wood missing from his attic. This wood matched the wood used to build the ladder, which was found outside the nursery window. Hauptmann was a carpenter by trade. Furthermore, Dr. Condon's contact info was written inside of a closet in Hauptmann's house, because paper, I guess, was too easy to dispose of, apparently. And lastly, another $20,000 worth of ransom money was found in his garage. His excuse? "Nein, I am holding those for a friend who is dead and cannot deny any of what I'm saying." Originally indicted in Bronx court for extortion, Hauptmann was soon extradited to Flemington, New Jersey, where he was indicted for murder. It didn't take long to convince a jury, and on April 3rd, 1935, just over 2 years after the kidnapping, Bruno was unalived by way of Thomas Edison's recliner. And that's basically it. That's the story of the Lindbergh baby kidnapping. Except this event was at the same time tragic, farcical, heartbreaking, infuriating, and downright absurd. Remember how after the first couple ransom notes, Lindbergh and Hauptmann agreed to work through a neutral third party? One they found by audience survey? And when I said that, did any of you stop and go, literally how? How does a retired high school principal with no affiliation with law enforcement end up negotiating the equivalent of a multi-million-dollar ransom with the kidnapper in, quote, the crime of the century? As absurd as poll the audience might seem, I think it was two things. One, before 1933, the FBI's focus had been on anti-sabotage efforts, breaking up organized crime, and raiding whiskey stills, some 2,000 of them in New Jersey alone, and a topic for another time. Negotiating with kidnappers was not yet part of their curriculum vitae. And two, it's possible that they were simply overwhelmed, what with the extensive work they were doing in other areas. Without being too circumspect, they were quite busy tracking down traditional leads and collecting confessions, something like 200 of them. But Wes, you dashing bastard, are you saying that 200 people were involved in the kidnapping? Okay, full disclosure, I keep seeing this number referenced in papers and articles everywhere, with absolutely none of them saying where it comes from or what it really means. Like, is that 200 coerced confessions at the hands of desperate yet unscrupulous Fed boys? Or does this include Anons writing into the newspaper claiming responsibility for attention or simple trolling? I don't know, but if someone does and they can share it, I will amend this video immediately. While it's unclear just how many of those 200 were given the hot seat, bright spotlight detective movie trope, at the very least we know the household staff and close acquaintances were grilled pretty hard, considering the kidnapper/murderer apparently accessed a second-floor nursery in a remote setting. The suspicion wasn't entirely unreasonable. I mean, imagine how ridiculous it would be to say that a culprit carried a ladder through a wooded area to get to the scene of a crime. No one would believe that. One member in particular, Violet Sharp, a server in the house of Elizabeth Morrow, Lindy's mother-in-law, was questioned aggressively and repeatedly. As you might expect, this ordeal left her quite shaken and distressed, and went on for over 3 months. Then on June 10th, she drank silver polish, which at the time contained cyanide, ending her life, only to be completely exonerated of any wrongdoing shortly thereafter. Just one of the numerous tragedies in this story. Getting back to the absurd for a moment, I'd like to talk about John Condon again. It's worth noting that Lindbergh initially asked 2 other men to act as intermediary. For reasons that are not immediately clear, Hauptmann did not approve of them. And so, when Jaffe offered his services, the kidnapper accepted. They all just decided to go with it. But why? What was in it for Jaffe, then 72 years old? A few things. He's described as, quote, a local personality, who was deeply troubled by the plight of the Lindberghs. He was reasonably well known, having penned numerous letters to the editor, and was boisterous as well as outspoken. Picture your grandma on Thanksgiving after 3 glasses of wine, but like on an entirely other level. My personal opinion, and I think I can back this up. 1. His Bronx-sized ego actually believed he was uniquely suited to the task. And 2. On a certain level, he just wanted the attention. I do believe that he genuinely wanted to help, even though he would later go on to personally profit from this involvement. He would appear in a number of vaudeville shows about the incident, and also penned a Jaffe Tells All memoir, which was published in Liberty magazine. Still, the whole thing was absurd. To close out the farcical and absurd category, let me tell you about Mr. Gaston B. Means. B. Means. B. Mean. I think it's actually Gaston. I'm going to stick with Gaston. Gaston was approached by Miss Evelyn Walsh McLean of Washington, D.C., who was another concerned citizen that wanted to help the Lindberghs. She and Gaston had been previously acquainted, and she knew him as an investigator. This was fortunate, Gaston said, because it just so happened that he had been approached to participate in a big kidnapping scheme just a few weeks earlier. Surely he could get in touch with the kidnappers. Or so Mrs. Walsh thought. He told her that he could, and she provided him with $100,000 in order to secure the release of baby Chaz. Well, after weeks went by and no progress was made, eventually Mrs. Walsh grew suspicious. Eventually, it was determined that Gaston was actually a con man, a since disbarred Washington attorney whose real name was Norman T. Whitaker. B-Mean was better. He was soon arrested. The numerous and downright preposterous circumstances of this case have naturally inspired many to consider alternative explanations. One of the juicier bits of alt-hype was that Lindy himself might have actually been the one responsible for the death of his son. Jacques! This theory appears to be largely based on the premise that Lindy was a eugenicist,
which was his style at the time,
and he was trying to devise an elaborate scheme to get his, again, quote, deformed son out of the picture, and that on 2 occasions Lindy had, again, quote, kidnapped the baby as a joke.
Are you okay, man? It was just a goof.
So there's that. In truth, this appears to be revisionism by academics who really didn't like his pro-eugenics bit. You see, Lindy had some views that proved to be awkward come the 1940s. Not exactly a National Socialist himself, but he was a bit of a fan of the Goose Step Brigade. He met personally with Hermann Goering and publicly stated that Germany was the only force standing between Europe and the, quote, Asiatic horde. To be fair, he wasn't a particularly moral man, having multiple affairs in which he sired 7 children that we know of. However, the more salacious conjecture pretty much falls apart under even a cursory investigation. So, in the end, it's a tragic story of a baby who was abducted from his crib, and tragically, if accidentally, killed in the process. What often gets omitted from the story is Anne Morrow herself, the boy's mother, and the hardship she endured in not only mourning the loss of her son, but in the spectacle that surrounded it. It's all a piece of New Jersey history. That'll about do it for me. If you stuck with me this far, thank you so much for watching. For my part, I'll be hugging my children a little tighter tonight. Sources in the description as usual. This has been Words and Coffee. Until next time.